How you guys feeling? End of the day, everyone's starting to fall asleep. We just did breath work in the green room, actually. So feel free to stand up, stretch, do whatever you need to do to stay awake. We're going to try and drop some really interesting knowledge on you to kind of wake you up. First, I'll start by just thanking the amazing panelists for coming in. We have Neil, who flew in from SF technically, but is based in LA. And I'm going to introduce each one of them. So Neil Devani is the founder and managing partner of Necessary Ventures. He invests in companies that improve people's lives, primarily focusing on companies using deep tech and those in the healthcare, climate, financial services, and education sectors. He completed his JD at Stanford Law School after working on the Affordable Care Act at the U.S. Senate, attended medical school at Drexel University, and completed a BS at Penn State. Next, we have Joel. Joel's local here in Austin. Joel's an entrepreneur and investor focused on technology solving the most pressing problems for people and the planet. Last year, he founded Climate Draft, an organization that inspires high-impact people to get involved in climate. Backed by investors like Chris Sacca and Tom Steyer, the organization represents the interests of 50 of the top VCs and climate tech startups. He's also the founder and chairman of Bedrock Energy and a board member of Curexa Pharmacy, a sponsor-backed healthcare company. He's been an investor since his first exit in 2015 of Soul Systems and is invested as an angel or an LP in 40-plus startups, venture funds, and private equity funds, all in line with his vision of a healthier planet and world. Lastly, but not least, we have Francesca. Francesca came in and is visiting us from New York. She is vice president at Fifth Wall, where she focuses on leading thematic work and executing deals across climate tech. Fifth Wall has a $500 million climate fund. She has spent her career in the climate space and deep tech. She was included in Fortune 40 Under 40 and Startup Basecamp's list of women driving the future of climate tech. Prior to Fifth Wall, she was an investor at G2 Venture Partners and KKR Global Impact. While at KKR, she co-founded North Star Collective, an impact investor network that currently has over 150 members. She started her career at Goldman Sachs and was in natural resources investment banking there. So thank you guys so much for coming. What an incredible crew. So we're going to start out, and I'm just going to ask each one of you to please share what your prediction is for climate tech this year. Who wants to kick it off?
I'm happy to. So I guess my prediction for the year, it's kind of two-part. One, I think climate dollars are going to start trickling into a lot of broader set of industries. And the second one is that climate funding is going to grow exponentially. And kind of the first part there, why I think it's going to go to a lot more industries. A lot of climate dollars have already flowed into some big heavy emitting industries like food, like transportation, like energy. But there are other heavy emitting industries that haven't gotten as much attention. Built environment being one key example. Fashion is another one that comes to mind. But specifically around the built environment, buildings made up 40% of emissions globally, and only about 6% of climate venture dollars have flowed into solving this problem for buildings. And every company, most companies operate in a building, and so this is definitely something that's applicable to anyone that's looking to decarbonize anyone that's looking to reduce their carbon footprint. And then on the second side, where I think it's going to kind of grow exponentially, the big piece of that, and this is probably why I originally got into climate tech, I think the adoption curve is going to be similar to tech. Every single company is going to need to adopt some level of sustainability, whether they like it or not, to remain kind of long-term viable. And so with that, it just means a lot more money needs to flow in to make that happen.
That's awesome. I hope that you are correct.
Yeah.
My prediction's similar but different. I actually think that funding will be fairly stable, maybe a slight increase or maybe even a slight decrease from this past year. But the amount of customer dollars, the amount of sales, the amount of actual real traction for these companies will grow exponentially. I'm on the ground as an advisor, board member, angel investor to all these companies. People are being pretty stingy with their investments and slowing down deployment of capital they have in the bank and they raised last year or the year before, thinking that this environment may stay the way it is for some time, and being nervous about trying to fundraise in an environment with where valuations can decrease pretty substantially. And from the investors and boards of the companies, they're saying the same thing. It's don't raise a Series A or don't raise a Series B this year. Try to get to 2024. So I think that people are going to be a little bit like less on the spending equity dollars and more on the like getting customer dollars.
I'm going to put myself more in France's camp. I think just from what we've seen, like the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, has been something that every company, every investor is thinking about, looking at the amount of money that's going to be flowing from the federal government and what we should be doing around that. There's also a lot of funds that have been raised from traditional financial LPs as well as impact-oriented LPs to invest in climate, and those GPs have to deploy capital. I was just in San Francisco until this morning and probably spoke to about 30, 40 GPs in the last 4 days, and every single one of them was saying the same kind of story, which was we were a little cautious last year, a little gun shy. Now we feel pressure. We have a lot of capital that we need to deploy. And so that's going to, kind of create pressure to have more volume in financing. So I think we'll see a lot more deals getting done this year than we did Q3, Q4, and probably see higher valuations given that there are funds that can only invest in climate or have to put a certain number of their dollars into climate tech companies. And the definition of that has become a little bit stricter than it was before. So that should create leverage for climate tech companies in terms of valuations. We have 2 companies that are currently out in market for a financing, and both of them have been getting an amazing response in the first week of the year, and they're both climate tech companies. Now, that's not really data, that's kind of 2 data points, but if we look at that as an example, I feel like that will probably continue throughout the year.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for your predictions. We'll wait and see who's correct.
I hope they're correct.
So, we spoke before, and Joel, you particularly picked up on the fact that, a lot of people sometimes say, like, how much can venture really do for climate? And, is it really more policy that needs to change? So I'm just curious what you guys think and what you guys tell people when they push back on how much can venture capital really impact climate change and climate, how much can climate tech really do at the earlier stages that we're investing in?
Do you want to start again?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's massively impactful. Obviously, I'm biased, but there's always been a public-private partnership in anything that has been dramatically impactful for humanity. If you think about how we've managed infectious diseases, if you think about how we're handling cancer, if you think about how we've innovated in food and ag, in supply chains, I mean, even the internet, like the evolution of the internet, there are public-private collaborations happening, and a lot of the private side is venture capital. In climate, I mean, you wouldn't have an Elon Musk without venture investors in his initial companies. You wouldn't have, he was the venture investor in Tesla, right? So like that is venture investment in what I would argue is the largest, most successful climate tech company in the world, in the history of the world. And so I think it's really obvious that venture capital has a massive role to play and will continue to play the role it already has.
Yeah, I guess the only thing to add is just, solving climate change, it's such a complex, multifaceted issue. We also need stakeholders kind of all around the table to solve the problem. And everyone's good at different things, kind of to your point, is that venture is probably better at helping drive innovation and make it go faster as well, and also answering and finding solutions that work for corporates without necessarily hurting their bank too much. And government and policy is really impactful at helping people with that transition, providing incentives maybe when it's not necessarily economically viable yet. And so they kind of all have a role to play, and also universities for educating the next wave of Elon Musks of the world. And so everyone needs to work together to solve this problem. We all get impacted by it, and we all contribute to it. So everyone's got to work together.
Agreed. Yeah. I think the big thing is speed and incentives. There's this great book by John Doerr called Speed and Scale. And it's like, okay, we got to solve this climate problem. I bet everyone here has flown over Houston at some point, maybe even today or yesterday, and they look at the scale of just oil and gas for like the southeast and southwest United States, and you're like, holy moly, we need the opposite of that to get the carbon out of the ground or into the ground or to like solve some of our climate issues. And we can't do that 20 years from now. I have to do that like right now. And I mean, I'm an entrepreneur through and through. I've started like 4 companies as a founder, CEO, and multiple exits and raised hundreds of millions of dollars of capital. I believe in entrepreneurship. I believe in VC-backed startups, and I believe that that is the only mechanism we have in a capitalist society to enact change at the level and scale and speed that we need for this crisis. I know there are a lot of people who argue, well, with the system, capitalism is the system that created this problem, and so it has to go away. And that may or may not actually be true, but the fact is that if we can't tear out the system and then also try a new system and find ways to solve the problem, like, we have the system we have, and working within it means that we need to align incentives. And I meet a lot of people. I do some geothermal drilling in one of my companies, and I meet a lot of oil drillers. And they just don't care about climate. They just don't. And there's a lot of people out there just like that. But they do care about money. They do care about when I buy $1 million rig from them. They do care about when I'm employing them to do work. And those things are incentives for them to change. And new technologies that are disruptive, that create wealth, that create profit, are like the common denominator incentive that we can use on anything, anywhere. And I think that just ends up having to come back to like creating companies that create value and money.
Just for the sake of playing devil's advocate, what do you guys think then about, in Europe, where there are policies that are pushing for more and creating better situations for climate-focused startups? Some would say that they're actually ahead of the U.S. in terms of their development of these companies. What are your guys' thoughts there around, like, one, do you agree or disagree? Are we behind Europe in that sense? And two, what can we do as investors, as family offices, as entrepreneurs to kind of, maybe there's some people that are from policy in the audience as well, that we can create a better ecosystem for us to kind of catch up and exceed?
I think it's going to be a global collaboration, right? I mean, if you look at like the solar industry, it is a multinational industry, as any major industry is, and everyone has their part to play. You could argue that what China is doing is distorting the market. At the same time, there are lots of companies across North America and South America that benefit from that distortion by importing that technology to then commercialize it for businesses and for homes. When you think about Europe, I mean, I think there's been a lack of innovation coming from Europe to America. If you think about like the major companies that have innovated in the last 10, 20 years, you could probably count them on one hand, right? And some of them really fit in kind of like the software, like entertainment category, and not really doing that much impactfully. There's some really interesting stuff happening with energy in Europe, a little bit with mobility, but not as much as you would expect, given how much subsidization there is by the EU. Even in, I was in Hungary 2 years ago, and they have a program where pretty much anyone can go get like 100K, 150K to start a company. It's really like a one-page application. Basically, anyone can get it. It has not resulted in anything meaningful. There are a few companies that are locally selling software, but they're not exporting outside of Hungary, and they're really disappointed in this program, given they spent so much money. It's become kind of a scandal where the citizens are like, what are you doing with our tax dollars, right? So I think there's a question, like we do need public investment. I think the US is doing a ton of that, for example, with the IRA, but you still need capitalists. Like to Joel's point, you need people who are thinking about, is this going to make money? And the way that you make money is by solving people's problems at scale. So I think the US does that better than anyone else, and so glad we're investing here.
I was gonna say, yeah, I agree with that, and also, in case you can't tell from the accent, also made the choice to move here, partly because of that. And I also think when you think about Europe as well, every single country has its own regulations and own norms and own cultural norms. So it makes it very hard when you're thinking about scaling across the industry as well. Within the US, we just have a much larger playing ground and can probably loop in Canada as well into that. And so just scaling within one country is it's just not comparable kind of across the two. It's just so much bigger and better already. So that's kind of one piece of it. And then within the EU, the only thing I would say kind of as within climate change pushback is that the average consumer is just a lot more educated on this space. You don't need to have, for example, residential solar. In the US, that's still very door-to-door salesman, and so that's why CAC is astronomical and makes it sort of difficult. But in the EU, like in Germany, all those players are just doing it online because the average consumer knows what panels they want to buy and knows the amount of energy that makes sense for their home. I don't think that, we're just behind kind of in terms of that stuff. And also even thinking about, little stats like, oh, fashion's incredibly bad for the environment. I don't think the average consumer thinks like that. And so it's stuff like that I think is where they're really ahead of us.
I 100% agree with that. Without getting into the cultural differences of Europe and the US when it comes to innovation, like they are way ahead of us in deployment of consumer and commercial technologies. Most of those technologies were made here, probably even manufactured here, and are exported to Europe. And I'll give you an anecdote. I was very interested in a specific kind of technology called phytomining, which you literally grow metals out of heavy metal earth, like old mines and stuff, and I thought it was really interesting. And I found this company in Europe, and they've been doing it for 7 years. Like, they've been working on this technology for 7 years, have no commercialization. They're still like working with a university. And then I met a company in the US who started like 6 months prior, already raised like $9 million from lower carbon, and Chris is excited about it. And I was like, and these guys are just like already like, I got a commercial deployment, it's coming in this, and this. They're like, I was like, holy mackerel. Like, these guys in Europe knew about this a long time ago, and you're just like getting eclipsed by this new company. Just like an anecdotal evidence, but I think that's how I view the difference. But wait, one last thing about Europe. I love that their consumer markets like understand these issues and care. I love that Europe is making policies that require these things. I think they create really good markets and incentives to build these technologies. And there's another piece, which is just that climate change is not just emissions. It's also things like land use and things like water use and all of these things.
Chemical runoff.
Yeah. And Europe is thinking about those things and designing their cities in those ways. And it's a test bed for like, how do you deploy, more bikes and bike lanes, and how do you use like more natural agricultural like feedstocks and stuff like that. And I think that's really, 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 really important.
And one other thing to add to that as well, I think in Europe they do a much better of investing back into their infrastructure. I'm thinking public transportation systems, just like different class compared to what we have in the US.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. I lived in London for 5 years. Definitely much more advanced. Just switching gears for a bit. There's a misconception that businesses that are impact businesses can't generate returns. And I was digging around and I found some numbers by Cambridge Associates that said clean tech startups have actually financially outperformed the rest of the startup world. So why do you think that climate and climate startups particularly are creating better returns? And what sectors do you think in the future have the most growth opportunity?
I think there's two main reasons why people like think this way about climate. One is they're inundated every single day with doomerism, which is it's not solvable, it's never going to be solved, and the world is completely fucked, and nothing you can do about it, so don't even try. And so people just put their head in the sand, they don't think about it, they don't care about it, and they think that it's just like anyone who's going to do anything about it is just doing it because they're like, a bleeding heart liberal or some sort of like, person who's just doing it for the planet. And I think the second piece is really around like this. I don't actually know how this happened, but there's this sense that climate is a philanthropic thing, that you have to burn all this money on big infrastructure and that you're not doing it for profit. I think it's kind of outdated. Maybe it's like a clean tech 1.0 thing. I wasn't around for it, so I don't know. But I hear that a lot from older investors, and I don't actually know where it came from, but I know that it exists as an issue.
And one thing I always think about as well is that, when I chat to old mentors, that first wave of tech investors as well, they were also sort of kind of bucketed like that for a while. It was like, oh, this is just kids playing with toys, essentially, was sort of the vibe. And I think it's sort of the case whenever there's a new emerging class that's kind of a little bit of the attitude around it. It's like, how can you make better returns? Like, it's not a traditional industry. Ironically, tech is now one of those traditional industries that kind of think of it that way. And I just think we're in the early innings of kind of this adoption curve. And so it's just going to accelerate quite rapidly, particularly as like every company starts adopting some of these solutions. Yeah. And I think that coupled with there is kind of value alignment is what makes it seem like maybe there's kind of lower returns that we're targeting there. But don't necessarily want to speak for all of you, but I think this is the case that we're investors first. We lean on the capital I of investor versus impact. It just so happens the vertical we get to look at on a day-to-day also does good things for the world. But that's just kind of our vertical lens. We're still investors first, looking for kind of good returns and great founders and companies.
I like how you said that. We think about it as like if you're solving a problem, there's usually someone who wants to pay for that solution. And therein lies the business. And if you're solving a very real problem, a very hard problem, you have inherent defensibility, you have a moat. And so when you think about the history of the world, you can find examples of companies that solved problems that people had, and they didn't consider themselves impact companies because, before 1996 or 1994, social responsible investing wasn't a thing. Impact investing wasn't really a term until 10, 15 years ago. But there were still people like, oh, we need to solve problems. Here's a business that we can use to solve the problem. So when you think about that, if climate is a massive problem, if we're talking about mobility, we're talking about energy, at least in the previous generations, those are really meaningful big problems. Like everyone needs energy, everyone needs to get around, we need to move things. And so the scale of these companies is massive. I don't know what year that data is from, but if you look at Tesla, Tesla's just like the example I always come back to because everyone knows it, but you can apply this elsewhere. If you think about Tesla when it first came to the public market, it wasn't that big of a company. If you think about where it peaked in terms of valuation, it's one of the biggest companies in the world. So depending on when you're measuring that return, like Tesla's larger than every other climate tech company combined, right? They were bigger than every car company combined. But when you think about what made them successful, and of course building something that people want, solving a real problem, there's a pattern that we see in all of the climate tech companies we invest in, and actually in the companies we invest in outside of climate tech, these companies that are solving real problems and can talk about it in a meaningful way have 3 different areas they can outcompete any other company. And it's around talent, around capital, and attention. And this is what we look for in every case, which is again true in the Tesla case. You've probably all heard these stories. If you think about talent, there's so much more well-positioned to attract great talent, to keep that talent, to get the most engagement from that talent, versus working at Ford or GM or Toyota. When you talk to people who work at Tesla, there is this fervor, there is this passion, this like cultish mentality of we are going to save the world by going to work every day. That makes a huge difference in terms of productivity, in terms of output, in terms of you don't need to recruit the same number of people or work as hard to recruit that talent because people want to work there already, differently than what Toyota has to do to get people to come work there. When you think about capital, it's not just traditional market capital. So Tesla, like many other climate tech companies, availed itself of public financing. And that allows them to have a lower cost of capital. If you have a lower cost of capital, that's great for shareholders. That means better returns. So when you look at climate tech companies, you look at companies that are doing things that are quote unquote impactful, if they can tap into non-dilutive grant financing, if they can tap into subsidized loans, that's going to take off pressure on the equity capital, which allows for better returns. Back to that Cambridge point. And then the third piece around attention, this is, masterful with regard to Tesla. Like, how many Tesla ads have you ever seen? They don't really advertise, right? They don't need to because the press is constantly talking about them. They're constantly putting out their own content that they don't have to pay for distribution, so they're doing content marketing. They have earned media and they have owned media. They're skipping paid media. That saves them a ton of money. Again, less pressure on the equity capital, better returns. It's a pattern that you see over and over in climate tech, in impact tech, and what it means is better returns, provided, of course, you're solving a real problem, right? If you're not, then you don't have a business and none of this matters. But if you solve a real problem, you can do these things, and that gets you better returns.
And one other thing to add on that, I also think we're at an inflection point within climate as well, is that I feel like for a while it was more about like risk management, like that's what climate tech was, it was risk management. And now we're really in a stage where people are seeing we can actually save money by investing in climate tech as a corporation, or it will actually create a new revenue stream altogether. And so that's kind of a big shift that's happening in the market.
Yeah, I believe, I agree with both of you guys. The non-tech businesses are just big. Like oil and gas, like extraction is like $5 trillion. Like if someone figures out nuclear fusion, they are effed. They are totally done. Like why would we put all this money towards all this stuff? Like we're talking about, technologies that unlock the like incumbents that have been around for hundreds of years and just can decimate these gigantic markets. And if you're looking for asymmetric returns, which is what you should be doing if you're, a VC, then that is like the ultimate, which is like, my goodness, if you can figure out these technologies, these promises that are being made, then you have a real chance of being some of the largest, most powerful companies in the world. People don't, I don't know how many of you guys have any experience in oil and gas. Like most people from tech, and I'm from New York, don't ever think about it. And then you come out here and wow, like energy is way bigger than tech. They're making, a lot of these guys are making a lot of money, have generational wealth from oil extraction, even like these niche little things. They're extracting oil in this one little way in this one little part of Texas, and you're like, wow, have hundreds of millions of dollars of personal wealth from those things. And I don't think people really understand how big those industries are because they don't have exposure to them. But those things have a real chance of like changing.
Amazing. It was such a great answer. I think I'm going to remind you of part 2 to the question, which is, given that there's so much opportunity in this space and we can create returns while also having a positive impact, what sectors, for the people in the audience that are investors as well, would you say like, hey, I would really spend some time in this sector over the next couple of years. I think it's going to blow up.
So if you're talking just in climate tech, obviously, right? Yeah.
Just in
So
climate, yeah.
you could take the thesis of you want to pursue what's already being funded by other people and kind of ride that wave up, or you could be contrarian. I would say any of these sectors is perfectly fine. The thing you want to do is really focus on what is your edge in that sector. So if you look at mobility is definitely overfunded. A lot of EV companies getting funded. This relative positioning I'm talking about in terms of overfunded is based on how much money is going into that sector versus like what percentage of emissions it's responsible for. So if you use that as a ratio, you would look at mobility and you would see it's like 3x overfunded. You would look at energy and see it's 2x overfunded. If you looked at food and ag, it's about 50% underfunded. If you looked at heavy industry, if you looked at like manufacturing, chemicals, commodities, that whole segment of quote unquote industry, it's about 75% underfunded. Built environment, which Fran was talking about, also dramatically underfunded, like 75% underfunded. So you have to kind of think of yourself as an investor and say, am I someone who is already in the stream, I get access to good consensus deals, and I want to do those? Okay, maybe stick to mobility and energy. If you're someone who's outside of that stream, outside of that environment, and you like the idea of going to find the contrarian bet to go into the areas where other people are not going, then you want to look at heavy industry, built environment, something like that. And if you don't know, then maybe food and ag, just stay in the middle, something like that.
Yeah, I feel like you basically said everything I was going to say, so the only small one to add. No, great. That's awesome that we're kind of aligned there. And the only other industry that I have been spending a lot of time thinking about as well is like around circularity. It's also kind of a sector. It's like we have made a lot of things in this world, and if we just figure out how to reuse a lot of the materials that are already out and functional in the world, and repurpose those and kind of put them back into the economy, that'd be great. I'm like, what is in scrapyards and landfills that really we should be using to put back into the system versus taking stuff back out of the ground again? So that's kind of an area I think is not gotten that much attention historically. Like circularity is just not, even within climate tech, not that popular of a sector, I feel like, and I think there's going to be a wave of that going forward.
I like all of that. I'm really excited right now about synthetic biology generally. And AI more broadly, applicable to basically everything. Software, it's easy for people to understand, very easy to explain to a VC. I have an anecdote I think is interesting for this group because I think you guys are all looking for ways to deploy capital. Obviously, the easiest way is to pick great people like them and invest in their funds and have a big portfolio. They usually perform better over time, but I imagine many of you guys have the sources of your wealth are either real estate or some family business or a business you guys started, and in each of those things you can be a customer. And my favorite strategy has been to find a early stage, like an early customer investor. So for my geothermal company, we're doing heating, cooling for very large buildings, 50,000 square feet and above, like millions of square feet. And one of our first investors is one of the largest holding companies of real estate in the U.S. And they've committed to doing multiple $1 million projects with us in the first year. And they gave us $1 million, and we turned around and took that same money and that promise of pilots, and we're like, can now raise a lot more capital to deploy against that. I imagine that if you have businesses that are dominant in your industries, you can be a first customer. And that's amazing. You can just go be like, I'll give it to me at 20% discount and turn around and raise more money. It's just like it's like a no-brainer. Anyway, my own thoughts.
No, thank you for sharing that. Do you want to add something?
No, just, I really like that idea. It's something that I think when we talk to like large corporations, it's something they're thinking about as well, and that moves the needle. It moves the needle for startup partners. It moves the needle for public perception. I think that's a really, really good point.
Yeah, and well, we have a lot of corporate partners as part of our LP base, and it's actually great for diligence too, because to your point, like they're customers. That's great. It's very useful. You can actually hear about what their pain points are to be able to deliver there.
Amazing. So you guys kind of talked a little bit about what sectors are maybe the ones that we should be looking at. Are there any under clean tech that you think will die or that overfunded and that we should kind of stay away from?
Oh man, I'm probably not gonna earn any friends for this. Fake meat and like any of these like derived food products that are highly processed. I think they're bad for human health. I don't think they help. Most of the time, they're probably a net negative on the planet, honestly. Yeah.
Why do you think they're a negative on the planet?
Not all of them. I'm sure there are some that are great. The Earth has done a really good job over millions of years, like developing its own ecosystems, and I don't think humans have a good enough grasp about how those systems work to try to redesign all the things that go into food in a way that like supports those ecosystems like holistically. There's this amazing book called The World Without Us that imagines what happens if humans just disappeared like that, how things break down in the ecosystem and like how the forests come back. TLDR is like the world will heal itself, like without us, it'll be totally fine. And all the things that we've destroyed will come back in time. I think that we need to like work with the planet, not try to like redesign things completely. So things like permaculture and better ways of doing ag and using less water and like those technologies I'm all for. I think trying to reimagine those, and I've done some bunch of work and diligence in this space, so it's not like I hate it completely. But I think broadly speaking, I think that they're usually like worse for human health, not well understood, and the health and also planet impacts aren't well understood.
I'm gonna save
Sorry.
everyone. No, I think that's right on. I'm gonna try and save everyone some money here. Do not invest in a carbon accounting or a carbon marketplace company.
Actually, the first startup I ever worked for was a carbon accounting startup. And this was like over a decade ago. So they've never worked. But as a company, there's no sustainable model.
There will be some. There will be some that will be successful. You're not going to be the person to find them. Unless you're a full-time software or marketplace investor and you've been doing it for 10 plus years and you've had success, trust me, you're not going to be the person. There are too many companies pursuing it. Every software investor wants to invest in climate. Every software investor is shit scared to invest in anything that doesn't have 80 to 90% gross margins and they can get to $1 million of revenue in the first year, or already has multiple millions of dollars of revenue and is growing multiple 100% per year. Like it's not a sector that you're going to be able to compete in. And there's also already way too much competition. So that's my one place to avoid investing.
I was going to say software too, so good to know that we're aligned again. And the reason for that is like there are traditional tech investors that are just flowing into climate because they can see the returns, they see the valuations, but to your point, they're too scared to necessarily do some of the like deeper tech stuff. And you can't really solve climate with just with just software, sorry. So it's an enablement tool, but if there's nothing to enable because you haven't only put money in the software, sort of defeats the purpose. And so you've got to have a little bit of everything. And if you look at any climate portfolio, it's going to have a whole smattering. It's going to have some software, hardware, services, kind of all the above is necessary. And now because there's so much competition from those traditional investors like the Sequoias of the world, it's just kind of bidding up the valuations too. So if you're looking for great returns, that's kind of not the way forward.
Amazing. Well, speaking of great returns, do you guys want to share one or two of your favorite recent investments and why you're excited about them?
Yeah, this is a closed audience. I know you all. I hope there's no SEC regulators, so this is not general solicitation. We have two companies in market right now that we led the pre-seed rounds for, and I'm very excited about them. One is called Ruby. They convert carbon dioxide into textiles, so they use cell-free enzymatic processes. This is like synthetic biology, like Joel was mentioning. It's a very well understood process. They end up with cellulose, which is what you use to make a lot of different types of textiles. It's a very well understood, established stream of commerce. So when they show up to a partner, They're partnered with Nike, Levi's, H&M, a bunch of other brands. They're offering something that they already buy, and they're telling them, in a few years, we will offer it cheaper than anyone else can offer it to you. But for now, you have to pay a premium because we're just getting started. And, oh, by the way, we're the only people who are making this from carbon dioxide emissions. Everyone else is making it from plant material the traditional way. So it's a very, very compelling value proposition to twin sisters, both scientists, fascinating team. The other company is called Magrathea. Magrathea, they're a little bit more sensitive about their information, but they produce magnesium from seawater, so metal without mining. There's tons of magnesium in seawater, even more in brine in lakes, and so you can, and also in like runoff, like wastewater from potash plants and places like that. So you take this water, you evaporate it, you're left with the salt. You can turn that over time through different processes into metal and into magnesium specifically. Magnesium, 96% of magnesium is made in China, and it's made using strip mining and a coal-fired process, so it's very pollutive, it's very emissive. But magnesium is this fascinating metal that is lighter than steel, it's lighter than aluminum, it actually has a higher strength ratio than both of those metals, so it's great for if you want to make cars lighter, let's say, because all of a sudden cars are very heavy because they're carrying lithium-ion batteries. It'd be nice if you can make them lighter, enter magnesium. So this company is producing it in a way that, again, will also be able to be much lower cost than any of the incumbent metals. And if you think about the size of that market, I think magnesium's like 5 to 10 billion a year. Aluminum and steel are much, much larger. And so we're really excited about that company too.
Very cool.
I'm not as active as an investor as these guys, so I won't give you things that are in market. I did a deal before I was even interested in climate in this synthetic biology company called C16 Bio, which is I think people might actually know, that does literally an angel investor when I was doing mostly healthcare stuff, but I just loved them. They're making palm oil from fermentation of like you'd make beer, and it avoids cutting down rainforests in Borneo and other places, which I think is amazing. I don't think that they're raising right now, but if you ever come across Shara, she is awesome. And if you have any companies that you own that use palm oil in your products, then you should definitely replace it with what she's making. It's awesome. And then I'll tell you, I mean, I guess I would love to tell you guys about Bedrock, which is the geothermal company that I started last year. And I think why it's interesting is that I met this scientist a year ago who was at Baker Hughes, which is the largest drilling operator in the world. They drill all the oil and gas wells. And he designed all this technology for fracking. And he was just tired of being there. He wanted to find new ways of like using that skill set for climate. And he had this like basic idea that the stuff that he was making for oil and gas wells could be applicable to geothermal wells. And I met this guy, and he was like, "I'm gonna get an MBA student I'm gonna get a university. He was given a professorship at UT. He moved here from Canada, and he was like, I'm gonna get an MBA student. I'm gonna figure out a way to make this a business." And I was like, "Wow, this is really cool. Like, we need to figure out a way to like turn this into a company at the speed and scale that is required by this problem." And so we started very quickly. We found a CEO. We put in the capital, got this thing going. And within 3 months of getting this thing underway, we raised $6 million of pre-seed capital from top-tier investors, and have signed a deal for our first multi-million-dollar project, and broke ground like literally within 7 months of like starting the company. We drilled our first holes, and I think the reason I say that is I think there are a lot of opportunities like that are still on the table. And I would encourage you guys to take seriously even people who are like scientists or technologists who come to you guys with ideas, because they don't know where to get money. He didn't understand VC at all. He didn't understand 2 and 20. He didn't understand venture returns. Didn't understand the game at all. And if you don't understand the game and you're going to need to raise hundreds of millions of dollars, it's just never going to happen. So I encourage you that if you meet those kind of people who come to you because they're like, "Oh, you have money, you must be an investor," like you're the right person to talk to, and they don't get this game. Really encourage them and be helpful to them. Introduce them to people like Neil or to me or to other people who are entrepreneurs who can really point them in the right direction, help them get started, help them put it together.
And the majority of climate tech companies do have one university professor or deep scientist that doesn't understand business, and that's usually where it begins.
Yeah, there's a lot of those guys are still out there, and unfortunately, I've met a few that are like it was like a few years before I met them where they started, and they've been plodding around. They have a cap table of these weird angels, and it's like already so damn complicated that you don't want to waste your time doing it. But there's a lot of like things like that that are around. I think there's a lot of opportunity to like connect those people with the right, like if you're an LP in a fund and you meet a person like that, just like get them to the fund and be like, these guys all have like teams of CEOs and founders that they've backed before. They would love to give new ideas, like send it to them.
And we have a network of scientists that we tap into all the time because, I don't have a science background, so I'm not the right person to necessarily evaluate that tech, and acknowledging that and like pulling in those scientists, it's great, The deals that I work on a little later stage, so one of them is in market as well. So the first one I was going to mention is Sealed. It's a fintech company that also has a services component, but really what they do is help you put heat pumps into your home. And the US has 150 million-ish homes, and is very, very behind the rest of the world in terms of installing heat pumps. We still use furnaces in a lot of buildings. Heat pump tech is very much proven. It has been around for a while. It works. And so I believe that the reason why it hasn't really accelerated is because there are a lot of upfront barriers to people. It is expensive to get it done yourself, and also like where do you even begin? Like what technician, who's going to actually install it? All of that is just very complicated to figure out yourself. So they kind of manage that entire process and take out that barrier to entry. They pay for it up front themselves, and they also kind of manage that whole process. All you do is continue paying your utility bill, and that's how they get paid. So just kind of a solution that is very elegant from kind of the consumer perspective. So that's the first one. Second one is a company called Ascend Elements, battery recycling company. It's kind of what I was saying about circularity. They will take old feedstock, old batteries, and that's kind of what they buy off people, and they will break it back down into their raw materials, and then they can sell those components back to battery manufacturers. And we've all seen kind of the news articles around, we are running out of lithium in the world. What are we going to do if we want to actually electrify everything? We got to recycle. So, yeah.
That one sounds cool.
Yeah, that's very cool. Well, we have just a few minutes left, so keeping it short, I just want to ask you guys each one of you has either devoted all of your life or part of your life right now to climate and helping solve those climate issues by funding the solutions. I'm just curious, like, why climate, why now?
I love this question. So I think I'm one of the few people, maybe, or the only person here who's not like fully dedicated to climate, but every company we invest in has that same kind of profile. And I've tried a lot of different things in my life before finding venture as a job, and every day I feel just incredibly lucky to get to meet fascinating people, brilliant people who are putting their lives on the line. They're taking a lot of risk themselves to start these companies, to try to build something they believe in, and it's just incredibly intellectually and emotionally satisfying to work on these very hard problems with very brilliant people who have a very, very authentic sense of mission and purpose behind what they're building. And of course, like financially, it's pretty good too.
Appreciate the honesty.
Yeah, climate is the problem of our time. It eclipses everything else by orders of magnitude and is a contributor to almost every other problem that you care about as philanthropists, from poverty and malnutrition to refugee crises and wars. Like if you name it, I can point to you how climate has an impact on it, and how climate has impacted those things over the entire lifespan of human beings. When I found that out, I thought that it was like not a solvable problem. And then I read this book by Bill Gates where he sort of lays out in typical Bill format like exactly how you would do it in numbers. And I was like, holy crap, it is solvable. And also, oh my God, you can make lots of money. This is like perfect place for entrepreneurship. I got really excited about spending more and more time doing that. Also, the personal side of me, like just intellectually, it's like systems, it's like literally everything. It's the system of the system of the system. It is like human health and happiness. It is politics. It is supply chains. It is like science. It's, in some ways, it is consciousness. And that's just like a fascinating place to be.
Beautiful. Thank you for also bringing it back to the SDGs since we're at UN World Logic Day.
Yeah, I completely echo what both of you are saying here. And reason, I've always had a focus within climate. That's kind of what I spent my entire career focused on. And I'd say the original spark for me, and I always wanted to do it, was I grew up living Vietnam and Hong Kong. A lot of the worst parts of climate change are very much front and center throughout my childhood. I used to swim around plastic bags all the time in the ocean. That's just my reality. And so it was just something that was very close to home immediately. And to your point, again, finding ways to do that and intersect it with things I found intellectually stimulating as well. That was sort of the perfect marriage. Yeah, our vertical is, as you said, something that touches every single thing in the world. Even labor shortages is one that we didn't mention. Increasing automation is good for the climate, but also we have a labor shortage. That's kind of another intersection that we can chat about. And food supply systems as well. There's not enough food to go around. How do we solve it? But also food is the way we're kind of growing and doing agriculture right now is bad for the environment. They're kind of all intersecting across these massive sectors.
Wow, guys. Well, thank you so much. This has been really, really fun and educating, and appreciate you guys coming out. And thank you guys for being a great audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.